The whispers started the moment Clara Hensley walked through the doors of the Silver Creek Community Hall, her heart already hammering against her ribcage like a trapped bird. It was the spring of 1878 in the Montana Territory, and the annual town dance had drawn folks from homesteads scattered across 50 miles of rugged frontier landscape. Clara had spent weeks stitching her dress from fabric she'd ordered special from the general store, pale blue cotton with tiny white flowers. But now, as she stood in the lamplight with dozens of eyes turning toward her, she wished she'd stayed home with her widowed father on their small farm outside town. "Lord have mercy, look at the size of her," came a female voice, not quite whispered enough. Clara's cheeks burned hot as coals. She knew what they saw when they looked at her. At 23 years old, she stood 5 feet and 8 inches tall, which was considerable for a woman, but it wasn't her height that drew their cruel attention. Clara was what her mother, God rest her soul, had kindly called substantial, what the town gossips called fat. Her body was soft and round, her arms thick, her waist undefined beneath her carefully constructed dress. She'd inherited her build from her mother's side, sturdy German farm stock that could work from dawn to dusk without complaint. The fiddlers were warming up on the makeshift stage, and couples were already forming on the dance floor. Clara spotted her friend Margaret waving from across the room, standing beside her new husband. Clara forced a smile and began making her way through the crowd, acutely aware of how she had to turn sideways to pass between groups of people, how her dress brushed against others in the cramped space. "Surprised she'd show her face here," another voice carried over the general chatter. "Takes up enough space for 2 women." Clara's throat tightened. She kept walking, keeping her eyes fixed on Margaret's kind face across the room. She'd almost made it when Jackson Riley stepped directly into her path. Jackson was the banker's son, 25 and handsome in that clean, calculated way that spoke of easy living and inherited wealth. He'd danced with Clara once, 2 years ago, and she'd foolishly let herself believe he might have genuine interest. "Evening, Miss Hensley," Jackson said loudly enough that people nearby turned to watch. His friends flanked him, all dressed in fine suits that marked them as town boys rather than ranch hands. "Planning to dance tonight? Might want to make sure the floorboards can handle it." His companions erupted in laughter. The room seemed to tilt. Clara felt every eye on her now, felt the weight of their judgment and amusement pressing down like a physical force. Her vision blurred with tears she absolutely refused to shed in front of these people. "I was just," she began, but her voice came out strangled and weak. "What's that? Speak up," Jackson continued, playing to his audience. "Or are you too busy thinking about the refreshment table? I heard Mrs. Henderson brought 3 pies, but you might want to leave some for the rest of us." The laughter spread like wildfire. Even people who might have defended her remained silent, unwilling to draw Jackson's mockery onto themselves. Clara stood frozen, drowning in humiliation, when a voice like distant thunder cut through the noise. "Boy, you've got about 3 seconds to step aside before I move you myself." The crowd parted like the Red Sea. Clara turned along with everyone else to see the source of that deep, gravelly voice. The man standing just inside the doorway was nothing like the clean-cut town boys. He was massive, easily 6 feet 4 inches of solid muscle beneath a worn buckskin shirt that strained across impossibly broad shoulders. His hair was dark brown and hung past his collar, slightly wild as if he'd attempted to tame it, but nature had other ideas. His face was all hard angles and dark stubble, with eyes like cold mountain streams, pale blue-gray, and completely focused on Jackson Riley. "This doesn't concern you, Garrett," Jackson said, but his voice had lost its swagger. "Why don't you head back to whatever hole you crawled out of?" The mountain man, Garrett, moved with surprising grace for someone so large. He closed the distance between himself and Jackson in 3 long strides, and suddenly the banker's son looked like a child playing dress-up. Garrett stood so close that Jackson had to crane his neck back to maintain eye contact. "I heard what you said to the lady," Garrett said quietly, but his voice carried in the sudden silence. "Heard every word on my way in. Now you're going to apologize, or you and I are going to step outside and I'm going to teach you the manners your daddy forgot to." Jackson's face had gone pale. "I was just funning around. No harm meant." "Apologize." It wasn't a request. Jackson swallowed hard. "I apologize, Miss Hensley. I spoke out of turn." "Good." Garrett didn't move. Now you and your friends are going to move along and keep your mouths shut for the rest of the evening, or I'll be looking for you. Understood?" Jackson nodded quickly and practically fled, his companions scattering like startled quail. The crowd began murmuring again, but the tone had shifted. People turned back to their own conversations, the entertainment over. Clara stood rooted to the spot, shaking, staring at the man who had just upended her entire evening in the span of 30 seconds. Garrett turned to face her, and his expression softened considerably. "You all right, miss?" Clara nodded, not trusting her voice. Up close, he was even more overwhelming. His arms were thick as fence posts, his hands large and calloused from hard labor. There was a scar through his left eyebrow and another along his jaw. This was a man who lived rough, who survived in the mountains and forests that surrounded their settlement. She'd heard stories about him, the hermit who came to town twice a year for supplies and sold furs to the trading post, Garrett Stone, the wild man of Copper Ridge. "Would you do me the honor of a dance?" he asked. Clara blinked, certain she'd misheard. "What?" "A dance." He gestured toward the floor where couples were beginning to assemble as the fiddlers started their first real tune of the night. "That's why folks come to these things, isn't it? You want to dance with me?" The question came out before she could stop it, disbelief evident in every syllable. "Can't think of a single reason why I wouldn't," he said simply. "Unless you don't want to. I'd understand. I know I'm not much to look at, and I probably smell like horse and pine tar." A laugh bubbled up from Clara's chest, unexpected and genuine. "You're asking me to dance?" "Yes, madam." She looked around the room. People were watching with barely concealed curiosity. Margaret was practically bouncing with encouragement. The alternative was leaving, going home to face her father's sympathetic looks and her own misery. Clara made a decision that felt like stepping off a cliff. "Yes," she said. "Yes, I'll dance with you." The smile that broke across Garrett's rugged face transformed him entirely. He offered his arm, rough flannel beneath her fingers, and led her onto the dance floor. The fiddles swung into a waltz, something slow and sweet, and Clara felt her nerves spike again as they reached the center of the floor. "I should warn you," she said quickly, "I'm not very graceful." "Good thing I don't know what I'm doing either," Garrett replied. "We'll figure it out together." He placed one massive hand on her waist, gentle despite his obvious strength, and took her other hand in his. They were both large people, but somehow when they came together, it didn't feel awkward or wrong. It felt like matching pieces. Garrett began to move, leading her through the basic steps of the waltz, and Clara followed. He wasn't as clumsy as he'd claimed. His movements were deliberate and sure, and he held her like she was something precious. They swayed together, turning slowly with the music, and Clara felt something inside her chest crack open, not breaking, but blooming. Around them, other couples danced, but Clara had stopped noticing. All she could see was this mountain of a man who had appeared out of nowhere to defend her honor and was now holding her like she mattered. "Thank you," she whispered. "For what?" His pale eyes met hers, genuinely puzzled. "For what you did. For Jackson. For this." Garrett shook his head slightly. "No thanks needed. I can't abide bullies, and that boy needed taking down several notches. As for this," he glanced around the dance floor, "this is purely selfish on my part." "How so?" "Been watching you for about 6 months now," he admitted, and a flush crept up his neck. "Come down from the mountain more often than I need to, just hoping I might see you in town. Never had the courage to speak to you before tonight." Clara's heart stuttered. "You've been watching me?" "That sounds worse than I meant it," Garrett said quickly. "I just mean I've noticed you. The way you help old man Peterson carry his supplies to his wagon, how you always have a kind word for everyone, even when they don't deserve it. You've got the prettiest smile I've ever seen, and I've been halfway in love with you since the first time I saw you laugh." The world seemed to narrow down to just the two of them, swaying in the lamplight while the fiddles sang. Clara had been told many things in her life, but never that she was pretty, never that someone had fallen in love with her smile. "I don't know what to say," she admitted. "Don't have to say anything," Garrett assured her. "I didn't tell you to make you uncomfortable. I told you because life's too short and too hard out here to keep quiet about things that matter. I saw my chance tonight, and I took it. If you tell me to leave you alone after this dance, I will. But I had to try." The music swelled and dipped, and Clara made another decision. I don't want you to leave me alone. The smile that earned her could have lit up the entire territory. They continued dancing as the song ended, and another began. Other couples came and went, but Garrett and Clara remained on the floor, lost in their own world. She became aware of people watching, but for once it didn't feel like judgment. It felt like wonder. Eventually, the music paused for the musicians to rest and refresh themselves. Garrett led Clara off the floor to the refreshment table, where Margaret immediately pounced on them. "Clara Hensley, you have been holding out on me," Margaret said with delight. "Who is this gentleman?" "Garrett Stone," he supplied, offering a polite nod. "Pleased to meet you, madam. Margaret Walsh, Clara's dearest friend, and I need to borrow her for just one moment." Margaret linked her arm through Clara's and practically dragged her away before either could protest. Once they were sufficiently distant, Margaret whirled on her. "That is the most eligible bachelor in 3 counties, and he cannot take his eyes off you. What happened? How do you know him?" "I don't know him," Clara said, still dazed. "He just appeared and defended me from Jackson and then asked me to dance." "Like a knight in buckskin armor," Margaret sighed dramatically. "Clara, he's looking at you like you hung the moon. You have to see this through." "See what through? Margaret, he lives on a mountain. I live on a farm. He's being kind, that's all." "Kind?" Margaret grabbed Clara's shoulders. "Men who are being kind do not look at women the way that man is looking at you. Trust me, I'm married. I know these things." Clara glanced back toward the refreshment table where Garrett stood, a glass of punch in each hand, scanning the crowd until his eyes found her. The intensity of his gaze made her breath catch. "I'm terrified," Clara admitted. "Good," Margaret said firmly. "The best things in life are terrifying. Now get back over there before some other woman with sense claims him." Clara returned to Garrett's side, accepting the punch he offered. They moved to a quieter corner of the hall, away from the press of bodies and the worst of the noise. "Your friend seems nice," Garrett offered. "She's wonderful. Too enthusiastic sometimes, but wonderful." Clara sipped her punch, trying to organize her scattered thoughts. "Can I ask you something?" "Anything. Why do you live alone on the mountain? People in town say you're a hermit, but you don't seem like someone who hates people." Garrett considered his response carefully. "I don't hate people. I'm just not suited for town life. Too much noise, too many expectations. Up on the mountain, I can breathe. I can hear myself think. I've got my cabin, my traps, my hunting. It's a good life for a man like me." "Lonely, though," Clara said softly. "Sometimes," he admitted. "Especially come winter when the snow gets deep and I don't see another soul for weeks on end. But I always told myself I'd rather be lonely than trapped in a life that doesn't fit." "I understand that more than you might think," Clara said. She gestured around the hall. "Most of these people have known me my whole life, and I've never fit. Too big, too plain, too much of everything I shouldn't be, and not enough of what I should." "That's the biggest load of nonsense I've ever heard," Garrett said bluntly. "You're strong, that's plain to see. Strong is good out here. Strong means surviving. As for too big, you fit just fine in my arms when we were dancing." Heat flooded Clara's cheeks. "You're very direct." "Comes from living alone," he said with a hint of a smile. "I forget how to talk around things. If I'm being too forward, you tell me, and I'll mind my manners better." "No," Clara said quickly. "I like it. People usually talk around me or about me, but rarely to me. Not honestly." They talked through 3 more sets of music, tucked in their corner while the dance continued around them. Garrett told her about his cabin on Copper Ridge, about the view from his porch where you could see for miles across the valley, about the elk that came through in the spring and the way the aspens turned gold in autumn. Clara told him about the farm, about her father's failing health and her worry about managing the place alone, about her mother who had died 3 years ago and the loneliness of that loss. "I should offer to escort you home," Garrett said as the evening grew late and families began gathering their children. "It's not safe for a lady to travel alone after dark." "I came with my father," Clara said. "He's probably outside with the other men, smoking and telling tall tales." "Then I should at least walk you to him," Garrett insisted. They made their way outside into the cool Montana night. Stars blazed overhead in a display that never lost its majesty. Clara spotted her father near the hitching posts talking with several other farmers. He looked up as they approached, his weathered face showing surprise at the sight of the mountain man accompanying his daughter. "Pa, this is Garrett Stone," Clara introduced them. "Garrett, my father, William Hensley." The two men shook hands, her father's expression assessing. "I know the name. You're the trapper from Copper Ridge." "Yes, sir." "You were inside with my daughter?" "Yes, sir, we danced." William's eyebrows rose slightly and he glanced at Clara. She could see the questions forming, but he was too polite to ask them in present company. "Well, that was kind of you. Clara, we should be heading home. Got an early start tomorrow." "Yes, Pa." Clara turned to Garrett, suddenly awkward now that the evening was ending. "Thank you again. For everything." "Could I call on you?" Garrett asked, ignoring her father's presence entirely and his singular focus on her. "At your farm. If that would be all right." Clara's heart leaped. Yes, that would be more than all right. "Tomorrow?" "Tomorrow?" She laughed. "Don't you need to get back to your mountain?" "Mountain will still be there next week," Garrett said seriously. "I'd like to see you again soon. If I wait too long, I might lose my nerve." "Tomorrow, then," Clara agreed. "We're the Hensley farm, about 5 miles northwest of town. White house with green shutters." "I'll find it." Garrett tipped his head to her father. "Good night, sir. Clara." The way he said her name, soft and careful, made her stomach flutter. She watched him walk to his horse, a sturdy roan that seemed only slightly smaller than its owner. He mounted with easy grace and rode off into the darkness, leaving Clara standing beside her bewildered father. "Well," William said finally, "that was unexpected." They climbed into their wagon, and William clucked to the horses. They'd traveled nearly a mile before he spoke again. "You want to tell me what happened tonight?" Clara recounted the evening, from Jackson's cruelty to Garrett's intervention to the hours they'd spent talking. Her father listened without interrupting, his face unreadable in the darkness. "He seems like a good man," William said when she finished. "Rough, but good. But Clara, he's a mountain man. That's a hard life he lives up there." "I know, Pa." "I'm not saying you shouldn't see him," her father continued. "Lord knows you deserve happiness, and if this Garrett Stone can give you that, then he has my blessing. I just want you to go into this with clear eyes. The mountain isn't like the farm." "We just met, Pa. He's coming to call, that's all." William made a non-committal sound that suggested he didn't believe that for a second. "Your mother would have liked him, I think. She always said you'd need someone strong, someone who could see past the surface to who you really are." Tears pricked Clara's eyes. "I miss her." "I know, sweetheart. I do too." They rode the rest of the way in comfortable silence. When they reached the farm, Clara helped her father tend the horses before heading inside to her small bedroom. She changed out of her blue dress, hanging it carefully, and lay in bed staring at the ceiling. Sleep seemed impossible. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw Garrett's face, felt his hand on her waist, heard his voice saying he'd been halfway in love with her for months. It was terrifying and exhilarating and completely unexpected. Clara had resigned herself to spinsterhood, to caring for her father until he passed and then managing alone until her own days ended. The possibility of something else, something more, had seemed as distant as the stars. Now, suddenly, it was as close as tomorrow. She must have eventually slept, because she woke to sunlight streaming through her window and the sound of her father making breakfast in the kitchen. Clara dressed quickly in her everyday clothes, a simple brown skirt and cream blouse, and joined him. "Morning," William said, sliding a plate of eggs and bacon toward her. "You sleep all right?" "Eventually." Clara ate mechanically, her stomach too knotted with anticipation to properly appreciate the food. "What time do you think he'll come?" "If he's as eager as he seemed last night, probably sooner rather than later." Her father studied her over his coffee. "You really like him?" It wasn't a question, but Clara answered anyway. "I do, Pa. I know it's sudden, but when I'm with him, I feel seen. Really seen, not as what I look like or what people expect, but as who I am." "That's a rare thing," William acknowledged. "Don't let it slip away out of fear." Clara helped wash the breakfast dishes and then threw herself into her usual chores, feeding the chickens and collecting eggs, tending the kitchen garden, sweeping the porch. Every sound made her look up hopefully, but the morning crawled by with no sign of Garrett. By noon, she was beginning to think he'd changed his mind. Perhaps in the light of day his interest had waned, Perhaps he'd realized that rescuing her once didn't obligate him to anything more. Clara was pulling weeds from the tomato plants when she heard hoofbeats on the road. She stood, shading her eyes against the sun, and felt her heart soar as she recognized the roan horse and its massive rider. Garrett trotted up the drive and dismounted, once again moving with that surprising grace. He'd cleaned up since last night, his hair still damp and his buckskin shirt replaced with a dark blue cotton one that somehow made his eyes even more striking. "Afternoon," he called. "Hope I'm not too late." "Not at all." Clara brushed dirt from her hands, suddenly self-conscious about her work clothes and probably disheveled appearance. "I'm just doing some garden work." "Need help?" Garrett asked. "I'm pretty handy with plants. Have to be, living off the land like I do." They worked together in the garden, Garrett following Clara's direction as they weeded and pruned. He worked with the same careful deliberation he brought to everything else, his large hands surprisingly gentle with the delicate plants. William came out after an hour and nodded approvingly at their progress before inviting Garrett inside for lunch. Over sandwiches and cold tea, Garrett and William talked about farming and hunting, about the territory's changing landscape as more settlers arrived, about the politics of Montana statehood that everyone said was coming eventually. Clara listened, watching the way Garrett engaged with her father, respectful but not deferential, offering opinions when asked but not dominating the conversation. After lunch, Clara and Garrett walked the property. The Hensley farm wasn't large by some standards, just 40 acres. But William had made good use of every bit. There were fields of wheat and corn, the vegetable garden, an orchard with young apple trees, chickens, and 2 milk cows. "It's a good spread," Garrett said admiringly. "Your father built something real here." "He and my mother together," Clara corrected. "She worked as hard as he did, maybe harder. When she got sick, things got more difficult. Pa tries, but he's not as young as he used to be." "And you hold it together," Garrett observed. "I can see it in every corner of this place. Your touch." They stopped beneath one of the apple trees, still weeks away from bearing fruit. Garrett leaned against the trunk, looking down at Clara with an expression she couldn't quite read. "I meant what I said last night," he told her. "About noticing you. About being halfway in love with you." "Garrett, let me finish," he said gently. "I know we just met, formally anyway. I know you've got no reason to trust me or my intentions, but I want you to know that I'm serious. I'm not playing games. I'm not going to court you for a few weeks and then disappear back up the mountain and forget you exist. If we do this, I'm all in." Clara's mouth had gone dry. "That's a lot of certainty for someone you barely know." "I know enough," Garrett said. "I know you're kind and strong and brave. I know you make me want to be better than I am. I know that when I'm with you, the loneliness that's been my constant companion for years just vanishes. Maybe that's not enough for you, and if it isn't, you tell me now and I'll step back. But if there's a chance, even a small one, that you might feel something similar, then I'm asking for the opportunity to prove myself." Clara's hands were shaking. She clasped them together to hide it. "I do feel something," she admitted. "It terrifies me, but I do. You're not what I expected. Not in my wildest dreams did I imagine someone like you walking into my life." "So we try," Garrett said. It wasn't a question, but she nodded anyway. "We try." He reached out and took her hand, his palm warm and rough against hers. They stood there beneath the apple tree, hands linked, while the Montana sun blazed overhead, and somewhere in the distance, a meadowlark sang its complicated song. The weeks that followed took on a dreamlike quality. Garrett came to the farm every day, helping with whatever work needed doing. He repaired the barn roof that had been leaking since spring. He reinforced the chicken coop against predators. He worked beside Clara and her father from dawn to dusk, and every evening they would walk together, talking about everything and nothing. Clara learned about his childhood, growing up in a crowded, chaotic household in Kansas, the youngest of 7 children. How he'd left at 16 to make his own way, working as a ranch hand and then a scout, before finally settling in the Montana Territory 5 years ago. How he'd built his cabin with his own hands, every log cut and placed with care. "I'd like to show it to you sometime," Garrett said one evening as they sat on the porch watching the sunset. "The cabin, the mountain, all of it." "I'd like to see it," Clara said. "Maybe next week, if Pa can spare me for a day." William not only agreed, but practically pushed them out the door when the day came. Clara packed a lunch while Garrett saddled both horses, and they set out early in the morning, heading northeast toward Copper Ridge. The ride took several hours, climbing steadily into rougher terrain. The air grew cooler, scented with pine and wild sage. Eagles circled overhead, riding the thermals. "It's beautiful," Clara said, twisting in her saddle to take in the view as they gained elevation. The valley spread out below them, a patchwork of farms and forest, with Silver Creek just visible as a cluster of buildings in the distance. "Wait until you see the view from the cabin," Garrett promised. The cabin, when they reached it, took Clara's breath away. It was larger than she'd expected, built of sturdy logs chinked with mud and moss. A stone chimney rose from one end, and the porch Garrett had mentioned wrapped around two sides. But it was the location that truly amazed her. The cabin perched on a natural outcropping that looked east across the entire valley. Mountain peaks rose in every direction, still tipped with snow despite the summer heat. "Garrett, this is magnificent," Clara breathed. "Come inside," he said, and she could hear the pride in his voice. The interior was one large room, but thoughtfully arranged. A stone fireplace dominated one wall, with a bed built into an alcove opposite. There was a rough table and chairs, shelves lined with supplies and books, hooks for hanging clothes and gear. Everything was clean and organized, surprisingly refined for a bachelor's dwelling. "You have books?" Clara said, moving to examine the shelves. She recognized some titles, classics of literature and books on natural history, alongside journals that appeared to be Garrett's own writing. "Reading helps pass the winter nights," Garrett said, "and I like to keep records of what I see. Migration patterns, weather, that sort of thing." Clara pulled out one of the journals, flipping through pages covered in Garrett's neat handwriting and surprisingly skilled sketches of animals and plants. "These are beautiful. You're an artist." "I just draw what I see." He moved to stand beside her, close enough that she could feel the heat radiating from his body. "Clara, there's something I want to ask you." She set down the journal, turning to face him. "All right. I know we've only been courting for a few weeks. I know by all the rules of proper society I should wait longer, be more patient, but I've never been good at following rules that don't make sense, and waiting feels like wasting time we could spend together." He took both her hands in his. "I want to marry you, Clara. I want to build a life with you. Whether that's here on the mountain or down at your farm or somewhere else entirely, I don't care, as long as I'm with you." Clara's eyes stung with tears. "That's not a question." "Will you marry me?" Garrett asked, and his voice cracked slightly on the words, betraying his nervousness despite his bold declaration. "Please?" "Yes," Clara whispered. Then, louder, "Yes, Garrett, yes." He let out a breath that sounded like he'd been holding it for hours and pulled her into his arms. Clara wrapped her arms around his broad back, pressing her face against his chest. She could hear his heart hammering, as wild as her own. "I love you," she said into his shirt. "I think I've loved you since you asked me to dance." "I love you too," Garrett replied, his voice rumbling through his chest. "More than I thought I could love anything." He pulled back just enough to tip her chin up with one finger, and then he kissed her. It was gentle at first, almost hesitant, but Clara leaned into him and the kiss deepened. His arms tightened around her, and Clara felt safe in a way she'd never experienced before. Safe and cherished and desired. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Garrett rested his forehead against hers. "We should probably head back before your father sends out a search party." Clara laughed. "Probably, but I don't want to leave yet." They spent another hour at the cabin, eating the lunch Clara had packed and making plans. They would marry in Silver Creek, at the small church that served the scattered community. Clara would move to the cabin initially, but they agreed that they'd need to help William with the farm as much as possible. Perhaps eventually they'd build a house halfway between, close enough to support her father, but far enough into the mountains to satisfy Garrett's need for space. The ride back down the mountain passed in a blur of happiness. When they reached the farm, William took one look at their faces and smiled knowingly. "I'll put on coffee," he said. "Something tells me we have things to discuss." They told him over coffee at the kitchen table. William listened, asked a few pointed questions about Garrett's ability to provide for a wife, and then nodded his approval. "Your mother would have liked you," he told Garrett. "She always said Clara needed someone who wasn't afraid of life. When's the wedding?" "As soon as possible," Garrett said, "if Clara agrees." 3 weeks, Clara decided. That gives us time to arrange things properly. Those 3 weeks flew by in a flurry of preparation. Margaret and the other church ladies rallied around Clara, helping her sew a proper wedding dress from ivory silk that Garrett insisted on purchasing from the finest fabric in the general store. The whole town buzzed with gossip about the upcoming marriage between the hermit mountain man and Clara Hensley. Most of it was positive, to Clara's surprise. Garrett had won over many townspeople with his quiet competence and obvious devotion to Clara. Jackson Riley had left town shortly after the dance, reportedly sent by his father to manage some business interests in Denver. Clara heard through Margaret that Jackson had been given a choice: leave voluntarily or be escorted out by Garrett Stone. He'd chosen wisely. The wedding took place on a perfect August morning in 1878. The small church was packed with people, more than Clara had expected. She walked down the aisle on her father's arm, wearing the ivory dress that Margaret had helped her stitch with tiny seed pearls along the bodice. But Clara barely noticed the crowd. Her eyes were locked on Garrett, standing at the altar in a new suit that strained across his shoulders. His hair was neatly trimmed, his face clean-shaven, and when he saw her, his entire face transformed with joy. The ceremony itself was simple. They spoke their vows in steady voices, promising to love and honor each other through whatever hardships the territory might throw at them. When the preacher pronounced them man and wife, Garrett kissed her soundly, earning a few whistles from the assembled crowd. The reception was held in the same community hall where they'd first met. This time, when Clara walked through those doors, it was on the arm of her husband, and the whispers were of an entirely different nature. Margaret hugged her tightly, crying happy tears. William shook Garrett's hand and told him to take good care of his daughter or answer to him. "Wouldn't dream of doing otherwise, sir," Garrett assured him. They danced, just as they had that first night, swaying together while the fiddlers played. But now there was no tension, no uncertainty, just joy and the promise of the future spreading out before them like the Montana sky. As evening fell, they said their goodbyes and rode out toward Copper Ridge. Garrett had prepared the cabin for her arrival, adding feminine touches he'd clearly labored over. Fresh curtains hung in the windows, wildflowers filled a jar on the table, and the bed was made up with a beautiful quilt he'd traded for at the general store. "Welcome home, Mrs. Stone," Garrett said, lifting her down from her horse. "Home," Clara repeated, tasting the word. She looked around at the cabin, the mountains, the vast star-filled sky. "Yes, this is home." That night they came together as husband and wife, and Clara learned what it meant to be treasured. Garrett touched her like she was precious, his large hands gentle on her body, worshiping every inch of her. There was no shame, no embarrassment about her size or shape. There was only love and desire and the sweet intimacy of two people becoming one. Afterward, they lay tangled together in the narrow bed, listening to the night sounds of the mountain. An owl hooted somewhere in the pines. The wind whispered through the branches. "Are you happy?" Garrett asked, his fingers tracing lazy patterns on her shoulder. "More than I ever thought possible," Clara answered honestly. "Are you?" "Happier than I deserve to be," Garrett said. "I keep thinking I'm going to wake up and discover this was all a dream." "It's real," Clara assured him. "We're real." The first months of marriage brought adjustments. Clara learned the rhythms of mountain life, so different from the farm. She learned to read the weather in the clouds and the behavior of animals. Garrett taught her to shoot, insisting she needed to be able to protect herself when he was off checking his trap lines. She proved to be a natural shot, much to his delight. In turn, Clara brought order and comfort to the cabin. She expanded the vegetable garden, started a small herb plot, and filled the shelves with preserves and dried goods against the coming winter. She wrote long letters to her father and Margaret, describing her new life, and received responses full of love and support. Garrett proved to be everything a husband should be. He was protective but not controlling, encouraging Clara to explore and learn while making sure she knew how to stay safe. He worked hard, providing for them through his trapping and hunting and through the work they did together. They made trips down to help William with the farm every week, and Garrett and Clara's father developed a genuine friendship based on mutual respect. As autumn painted the mountains gold and red, Clara began to suspect she might be pregnant. She waited to be certain before telling Garrett, making a trip to town to see the doctor confirm her suspicions. When Dr. Matthews gave her the news, Clara rode back up the mountain with her heart singing. Garrett was splitting wood when she arrived home, his shirt off despite the cooling weather, muscles rippling with each swing of the axe. He looked up as she approached and immediately set down the axe. "You're back. Everything all right? You were gone longer than expected." Clara dismounted and walked straight into his arms. "Everything is perfect. Garrett, I'm pregnant. We're going to have a baby." He went very still, and for a moment Clara worried he wasn't happy. Then he let out a whoop of joy that probably echoed across the entire valley and lifted her clean off her feet, spinning her around. "A baby," he said when he finally set her down, his hands framing her face. "We're going to have a baby." "In the spring," Clara confirmed. "April, the doctor thinks." Garrett kissed her deeply, then dropped to his knees and pressed his face against her stomach. "Hello in there, little one. This is your pa. I can't wait to meet you." Clara ran her fingers through his hair, overcome with emotion. This, she thought, this is what happiness feels like. Winter came to Copper Ridge with a vengeance that year. Snow piled high around the cabin, and for weeks at a time they were completely isolated from the outside world. But Clara didn't mind. They had enough supplies to last until spring, a warm fire, and each other. Garrett pampered her shamelessly, insisting she rest while he handled the heavier chores, cooking meals when she felt too nauseated, rubbing her feet when they swelled. They spent the long winter evenings reading aloud to each other, or Garrett would play the harmonica he'd revealed he owned, surprising Clara with his musical ability. They talked about the baby, choosing names, arguing playfully about whether they hoped for a boy or girl. "A daughter with your strength and beauty," Garrett would say. "A son with your courage and heart," Clara would counter. "As long as the baby is healthy, I don't care which," they'd agree in the end. Clara wrote letters by lamplight to be carried down the mountain when the weather allowed, keeping her father and Margaret updated on her pregnancy and their life. Margaret wrote back with advice, having recently given birth to her own first child, a daughter named Rose. When the snow finally began to melt in March, Garrett made the trip down to the farm to check on William and stock up on supplies they'd need for the birth. He returned with not just supplies, but with Margaret herself, who announced she was staying until after the baby came. "Your father's orders," Margaret said when Clara protested, "and mine. You're not having this baby with just Garrett here, no matter how capable he is." Dr. Matthews rode up a week later, examined Clara, and pronounced everything progressing normally. "Could be any day now," he said. "I'd come back, but the trail's too difficult for regular trips. You'll have to manage with Mrs. Walsh here. She's delivered 3 babies, including her own. You're in good hands." The baby decided to make an appearance on a warm April afternoon. Clara had been hanging laundry when the first pain hit, sharp and unmistakable. Margaret, who had been watching her like a hawk for days, immediately took charge. "Garrett, get inside and boil water. Clara, let's get you to bed." The labor was long and difficult. Clara had heard stories from other women, but nothing prepared her for the reality of it. Garrett stayed by her side the entire time, letting her grip his hands hard enough to leave bruises, murmuring encouragement and love. "You can do this," he told her over and over. "You're the strongest person I know. Just a little more, sweetheart. Just a little more." Finally, as the sun set and painted the cabin walls gold, Margaret announced, "One more push, Clara, that's all, one more." Clara bore down with everything she had left, and suddenly there was a new sound in the cabin, a baby's cry, loud and indignant and perfect. "It's a boy," Margaret said, laughing and crying at once. "A big, healthy boy." She placed the baby on Clara's chest, and Clara looked down at her son through tears of joy and exhaustion. He was perfect, with a shock of dark hair and tiny fists that waved in the air. Garrett stared at both of them with an expression of such awe that it made Clara's heart ache. "We have a son," she whispered. "We have a son," Garrett repeated. He touched the baby's head with one finger, so gentle despite his size. "Hello, little man. I'm your pa. This is your ma. We love you more than you can possibly know." They named him Thomas William Stone, after no one in particular, but because they both liked the strength of it. Thomas, who would be called Tommy, was indeed a big baby, healthy and loud and demanding. Margaret stayed for 2 weeks, helping Clara recover and teaching both new parents the basics of baby care. When she finally left to return to her own family, Clara felt both grateful for her help and relieved to have her little family to themselves. Life with a baby was exhausting and wonderful in equal measure. Tommy inherited his father's size and his mother's determination, growing rapidly and keeping them both on their toes. Garrett proved to be a devoted father, walking the floor with Tommy at night when he was fussy, singing lullabies in his deep voice, fashioning tiny toys from scraps of wood. As Tommy grew, the cabin began to feel cramped. They discussed building an addition, but eventually decided on Garrett's original suggestion of building a new house halfway between the mountain and the farm. William's health was declining, and they both wanted to be closer to help him. They chose a spot on a rise with good water and views of both the valley and the mountains. That summer and fall, while Clara managed Tommy in the cabin, Garrett worked on the new house. William helped when he could, and sometimes men from town would ride out to lend a hand, won over by Garrett's integrity and Clara's kindness. By the time Tommy turned 1, the new house was finished. It was larger than the cabin, with separate bedrooms, a proper kitchen, and a porch that wrapped around the entire structure. Clara cried when Garrett carried her over the threshold. Tommy balanced on her hip. "It's perfect," she said. "Absolutely perfect." They moved in during a warm spell in November 1879. William came for dinner that first night, officially welcoming them to their new home. He looked older than his years, his breathing labored, but his eyes were bright with pride. "Your mother would be so happy," he told Clara as they sat around the new table Garrett had built. "Seeing you so settled, so loved. It's all she ever wanted for you." "I wish she could have met Tommy," Clara said, "and Garrett." "I think she knows," William said. "Somehow I think she knows." William passed away peacefully in his sleep 3 months later. Clara grieved deeply, but took comfort in knowing he died happy, having seen her settled and secure. They buried him next to Clara's mother in the Silver Creek Cemetery. Garrett held Clara as she wept. Tommy clutched between them and promised that they would honor William's memory by living well and loving hard. They took over the farm, combining it with their own land. Garrett hired help when needed, but still did much of the work himself, proving as capable with crops and livestock as he was with trapping and hunting. Clara managed the house and garden, cared for Tommy, and helped with the farm work when she could. Tommy grew into a sturdy toddler, and then a boy, running wild across their land with his father's fearlessness and his mother's curiosity. When he was 3, Clara became pregnant again. This time, the pregnancy was easier and the delivery smoother. Their daughter was born on a crisp October morning in 1882, smaller than Tommy had been, but just as perfect. "A daughter," Garrett said softly, cradling the tiny girl against his massive chest, "just like I hoped for." They named her Sarah Ann, and she had Clara's gray eyes and Garrett's dark hair. Where Tommy was bold and boisterous, Sarah was thoughtful and observant. They were opposites but devoted to each other from the start. The years flowed past like water. Tommy started school in Silver Creek, riding down with Garrett several times a week. Sarah followed when she turned 6. They were good students, popular with their classmates, never experiencing the cruelty their mother had endured. Clara suspected that had something to do with Garrett's reputation. No one wanted to cross the mountain man or hurt his children. In 1886, Montana achieved statehood, and the territory they'd known transformed into something new. Silver Creek grew, gaining a telegraph office and a railroad spur. The Wild West that Clara and Garrett had known was slowly being tamed, but their corner of it remained wild enough. More children followed, 2 more sons and another daughter. The house expanded with each addition, wings and rooms added as needed. Garrett joked that at this rate, they'd need to build another house entirely. "We could always go back to the cabin," Clara teased, "just the 2 of us once the children are grown." "I'd like that," Garrett said seriously. 20 years or so from now, when these little ones don't need us anymore, we'll go back up the mountain, just you and me and the sky." Clara kissed him softly. "That sounds perfect." But before that could happen, there was life to live. Tommy grew tall and strong like his father, eventually taking over most of the farm work. He married a sweet girl from town named Elizabeth, and they built their own house on the property. Sarah became a teacher, riding into Silver Creek every day to educate the next generation of children. The younger children followed their own paths as they grew. Through it all, Clara and Garrett remained the center of their family. They were the example their children followed, of what love looked like, of what partnership meant. They still danced together on the porch on warm summer evenings, swaying to music only they could hear, just as they had that night in the community hall so many years before. In 1895, when Clara was 40 years old and Garrett 42, they finally made good on their plan to return to the cabin. With Tommy and Elizabeth running the farm, and the other children mostly grown, they packed up and headed to Copper Ridge for an extended stay. The cabin was just as they'd left it, a little more weathered but still sound. Garrett made some repairs while Clara cleaned and aired everything out. They spent their days hiking the mountain trails, their evenings reading and talking, their nights wrapped in each other's arms. "Do you ever regret it?" Clara asked one evening as they sat on the porch watching the sunset. "Taking a chance on a farm girl you barely knew?" Garrett looked at her like she'd lost her mind. "Regret the best decision I ever made? Regret marrying the love of my life? Not for a single second. I was so humiliated that night," Clara remembered. "At the dance, I wanted to disappear, to never show my face in town again. And then I saw you," Garrett said, taking her hand. "Saw you standing there, so beautiful and brave, refusing to cry even though I could see how badly you wanted to. And I knew I had to do something, say something, or I'd regret it for the rest of my life." "Best decision you ever made?" Clara smiled. "Second best," Garrett corrected. "The best was asking you to marry me. Everything else was just steps leading to that moment." They stayed on the mountain through the fall, returning to the farm only when the first serious snows threatened. The years continued to pass, bringing grandchildren and then great-grandchildren. Clara's hair turned silver, and Garrett's dark locks faded to gray. His shoulders remained broad and his arms strong, though he moved a little slower than in his youth. Clara's body softened further with age, but Garrett still looked at her the same way he had at that first dance, with love and desire and wonder. In 1910, they celebrated 32 years of marriage with all their children, grandchildren, and great-grandchildren gathered at the farm. It was a chaos of noise and laughter and love. Clara stood on the porch, watching Garrett lift a great-grandson onto his shoulders, still strong at 67, and felt profound gratitude for every moment of their life together. That night, after everyone had left or gone to bed, they sat together on the porch swing Garrett had built years ago. The stars blazed overhead, constant as they had been that night of the dance. That night, everything changed. "I love you," Clara said into the comfortable silence. "More today than yesterday, and less than I will tomorrow." Garrett pulled her closer. "You got that from one of those romance novels Margaret keeps lending you. Does that make it less true?" "Not even a little bit." He kissed the top of her head. "You're my whole world, Clara Stone. You have been since the moment you said yes to dancing with a rough mountain man who had no business asking." "You had every business asking," Clara corrected, "and I had every reason to say yes. Best decision I ever made." They swayed gently on the swing, just as they had swayed together on the dance floor all those years ago. The mountain man and the farm girl who found each other when they needed it most, who built a life and a family and a love that would echo through generations. The story of how Garrett Stone had taken humiliated Clara Hensley in his arms and changed both their lives forever became family legend, told and retold to children and grandchildren. How he'd defended her honor, asked her to dance, and loved her exactly as she was. How she'd had the courage to say yes, to take a chance on a man who lived wild, to build a life that was different from anything she'd imagined, but better than she'd dared to dream. They had many more years together, growing old side by side, still laughing and dancing and loving with the same passion they'd had as newlyweds. When Garrett finally passed in 1918 at 75, surrounded by family, his last words were of Clara, his constant companion, his truest love. Clara followed him just 2 years later, and they were buried together on a hill overlooking both the farm and Copper Ridge, with a view of the mountains they'd both loved so well. Their descendants continued to work the land, to tell the stories, to remember. The cabin on Copper Ridge still stood, maintained by family members who used it as a retreat, a connection to their past. And in Silver Creek, now a modern town with electricity and automobiles, older residents still remembered the mountain man who'd swept Clara Hensley off her feet at the town dance, who'd shown everyone that true love looked past the surface to the soul beneath. The legend grew with each telling, but the truth at its heart remained simple and pure. Two lonely people had found each other in a moment of humiliation and turned it into a moment of transformation. A mountain man had taken a chance, a farm girl had said yes, and together they'd built something that lasted far beyond their own lives. In the end, that was what mattered. Not the opinions of small-minded people, not the judgments of those who couldn't see past appearances. What mattered was the love that had bloomed that night in 1878 when Garrett Stone walked across a crowded dance floor and offered his hand to Clara Hensley. What mattered was the life they'd built together, the family they'd raised, the example they'd set. What mattered was that when she'd needed him most, he'd been there. And when he'd been lonely, she'd filled his life with joy. They'd completed each other, two halves of one whole, and their love story became the standard against which all others in their family were measured. The dance had lasted only a few minutes, but the love that began that night lasted a lifetime. And even after both of them were gone, it continued in the hearts of their descendants, in the stories passed down, in the knowledge that true love exists and is worth fighting for, worth believing in, worth saying yes to, even when it appears in the most unexpected of forms. Their story was one of courage, of taking chances, of seeing past what everyone else saw to the truth beneath. It was a story of the Wild West, of Montana Territory becoming Montana State, of hard lives lived with grace and determination. But most of all, it was a love story, pure and simple and profound. And love stories, the good ones, the true ones, never really end. They just transform, becoming part of the fabric of family history, inspiring new generations to be brave enough to take a chance on love, to see past the surface, to say yes when the right person asks. Clara and Garrett's love had done all that and more. From that first dance to their final days, they'd shown everyone around them what love truly meant: acceptance, partnership, passion, and commitment. They'd taken the humiliation of one terrible night and transformed it into the foundation of something beautiful and lasting. The mountains still stood, watching over the valley. The farm still produced crops and raised livestock, tended by the fourth generation of Stones. The cabin on Copper Ridge remained a family sanctuary, a place to remember and honor those who'd come before. And on quiet evenings, when the stars came out and the wind whispered through the pines, if you listened carefully, you could almost hear music drifting across the mountains, the sound of fiddles playing a waltz, the echo of laughter and joy, and the memory of a mountain man and the woman he loved, swaying together in perfect harmony forever and always. Their story had begun with humiliation, but transformed into triumph. It had started with loneliness, but became about belonging. And it proved to everyone who heard it that love could indeed conquer all prejudice, fear, doubt, and pain. All it took was courage, kindness, and the willingness to see people for who they truly were. Garrett Stone had seen Clara Hensley that way from the first moment, and Clara had seen in Garrett not a wild mountain man, but a good man with a gentle heart and fierce loyalty. Together, they'd built something that lasted beyond their own years, creating a legacy of love that continued to inspire long after they were gone. That was the real magic of their story. Not the drama of that first night, not the romance of their courtship, not even the longevity of their marriage. The real magic was in how they'd lived their love every single day, in the small moments, in the grand gestures, in the way they'd raised their children and supported each other, and never let the world's harsh judgments diminish what they had together. They'd shown that size didn't matter, that unconventional lives could be beautiful, that love was measured not in appearances, but in actions. They'd proven that sometimes the best things in life came from the most unexpected places, and that saying yes to possibility, even when it scared you, was always the right choice. The town of Silver Creek grew and changed over the decades, but the story of Clara and Garrett remained constant, a touchstone for anyone who felt like they didn't fit, who worried they'd never find love, who wondered if they should take a chance on something uncertain. Their story said yes. Always yes, because the alternative, living safe but alone, protected but unloved, was no life at all. In the years following their deaths, their youngest granddaughter, who had inherited both Clara's gray eyes and Garrett's artistic ability, painted a portrait based on family descriptions and old photographs. It showed them as they'd been that first night, Garrett in his buckskin shirt, massive and protective, and Clara in her blue dress with the white flowers, soft and beautiful. They were dancing, caught mid-sway, looking at each other like they were the only two people in the world. The painting hung in the family home, in the house Garrett had built with his own hands, and every generation of children grew up looking at it, hearing the story, learning what it meant to love truly and completely. They learned that their great-great-grandmother had been mocked for her size, but that their great-great-grandfather had seen only her beauty. They learned that he'd been called a wild hermit, but that she'd seen his gentle heart. They learned that love meant seeing past what everyone else saw and having the courage to act on that vision. The legacy continued, generation after generation, each one adding their own stories of love and courage and determination to the family history. But it all traced back to that one night in 1878, when a mountain man walked into a dance and changed everything, when he'd seen a woman in pain and chosen to act, when he'd offered his hand and asked her to dance, when they'd swayed together and found in each other exactly what they needed. That was where it all began. And that was the story that never grew old, never lost its power, never stopped inspiring. Because at its heart, it was the simplest and most profound story there was. Two people who found each other, who chose each other, who loved each other through every trial and triumph life could throw at them. They'd started as strangers and became partners. They'd taken humiliation and transformed it into joy. They'd lived and loved and left behind something precious. And that, their descendants knew, was what it meant to build a life worth living. Not perfect, not easy, but real and beautiful and deeply, profoundly meaningful. That was the gift Clara and Garrett had given to all who came after them, the knowledge that love like theirs was possible, that it was worth fighting for, and that when you found it, you held onto it with everything you had. The mountains still watched over the valley, constant and eternal. The farm still stood, productive and prosperous, and the story of the humiliated girl and the mountain man who'd taken her in his arms and swayed lived on, a testament to the transformative power of love, courage, and the simple act of seeing another person's true worth. That was their story. That was their legacy. And it would continue. As long as there were people who believed in love, who needed hope, who understood that sometimes the most important thing you could do was take someone's hand and ask them to dance. Everything else, all the joy and beauty and meaning that followed, started with that one brave choice. Clara and Garrett Stone had made that choice. They'd lived it every day of their lives together, and in doing so, they'd created something that would never die, a love story for the ages, a beacon of hope, and the absolute certainty that true love, real love, could overcome anything. The end of their story was just the beginning of its legacy.